Good day, everyone. APA Standards and Codes Council and NFPA are pleased to present this webinar today. Please note that today's call is being recorded. All participant lines are muted during this broadcast. Today's presentation will last 60 minutes and include a Q&A session at the end. However, you can queue up a question for us at any time during the presentation. To ask a question, simply type it in the chat box area in the lower right side of your screen and click send. Should we run out of time for our Q&A, the remaining questions will be sent to the presenters and they will answer by email. Attendance certificates are being offered for this presentation. If you did not indicate you would like a certificate when you registered, please contact Billy Zadig at apa.org. It is my pleasure to now turn the presentation over to our presenters, Megan and Jeff.
Thank you, Billy. My name is Megan Halstrait, and I'm the director of the NFPA Fire and Life Safety Institute, Policy Institute, and I'm joined today by my colleague Jeff Sargent, who is one of our electrical code specialists for the eastern part of the U.S. And we're pleased to talk to you today about some of the things that we're seeing in the electrical code update world, so state electrical codes, and how that might impact things down the line. But before we launch into that, I just wanted to give you a very brief background on the National Fire Protection Association. So we're a global nonprofit organization. We were established in the late 1800s, and we're devoted to eliminating death, injury, property, and economic loss from fire, electrical, and related hazards. And I also want to emphasize, as we're often mistaken for a government agency, that we're not actually a government agency. We're an independent nonprofit organization. So one of the primary mechanisms we have for establishing and advancing safety are the codes and standards that we develop, so around over 300 of these codes. And I just wanted to give you a very high-level overview of the process that we use. So we have around 9,000 participants as of 2018 who work on our volunteer on our development committees, standards development committees. And it's a multi-step process with several opportunities for members of the public to participate. And we are overseen or are accredited by the American National Standards Institute to ensure that we're following certain rules around transparency, openness, and balance, making sure that everybody who has an interest can participate. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to talk a little bit about the National Electrical Code.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining Megan and I to discuss this very important public safety topic. As Megan pointed out, my job title is Regional Electrical Code Specialist. And what that entails is I am responsible for 25 states, and my colleague Tim McClintock are responsible for the other 25, but we act as technical liaisons at the meetings of the boards and the commissions and even legislative sessions to provide the safety background, the technical background, and the benefits achieved in the addition of the NEC that board, commission, or legislative body is looking to implement or update. You all manage facilities that have new and existing wiring systems that are covered by the National Electrical Code. So from the perspective of what you do, this is very relevant. So let me start out with this question. How many of you use the NEC today? I'm not talking about opening the book or viewing it on a computer or tablet, but rather, did you use the NEC? I'm certain that you all did, because from the time you got up to the time you joined this webinar, you personally made numerous interfaces with the electrical system in your home and at your workplace. And hopefully this interface did not pose you any harm personally or to the property in which you reside or work. We all use an electrical system on a daily basis, and we're highly dependent on electric power for many of our daily tasks. And you can thank the fact that there is a standardized set of installation rules that are used to regulate the installation of electrical systems to provide the safe interface. Everyone takes for granted that electric power will be available for those countless tasks we use it for, and that they won't pose a fire or shock hazard. So to the people who use the facilities that you manage, they're also expecting that, hey, they have that same level of expectation. But the safety system, which has worked so well for over 125 years in the US, is currently being chipped away at by political pressures and motivations that aren't necessarily looking at the safety benefit that the electrical code provides. So I presume that you all did use the electrical code at some point today, and that hopefully it worked well for you. And now let me provide a little bit of overview on the NEC. It has several different aliases. NFPA 70 is its designation within our codes and standards system. It is well known as the NEC, or the NEC code around the world. If you mention the NEC code, people know what you're talking about. And its official title is the National Electrical Code. It was first published in 1897, and it was, at that point, it was the National Board of Fire Underwriters who was responsible for the publication of the National Electrical Code. It was recommended by the Underwriters National Electric Association. And the original participants in the development of the 1897 NEC included insurance interests, engineering interests, manufacturers, code enforcers, insurance companies. So there were a number of different people involved that had an interest in electrical safety. And of course, in those early days, and as electricity was first being introduced into homes and into workplaces, the fire hazard was the major piece that needed to be addressed. The shock hazard piece evolved as the National Electrical Code evolved. Since 1911, NFPA has been the sponsor and developer and publisher of the NEC. And it fits perfectly within that NFPA mission that Megan described. The primary function of the National Electrical Code is to mitigate the hazards that arise from the use of electricity to protect people and to protect property. It's used in some way, shape, or form around the US in all 50 states, whether it's local adoption, county adoption, or promulgation by a state agency for mandatory regulation of electrical installations. It's used in the US territories, and it is the basis for the Canadian Electrical Code, as well as it is directly used as the regulatory document in a number of foreign countries, including Mexico, Ecuador, Panama, and others. It is the most widely recognized and implemented building construction code in the US. From coast to coast, we have that standardized set of electrical rules. It promotes uniformity in manufacturing. It promotes uniformity in design. It promotes uniformity in electrical licensing and regulation of practitioners who make the installations. Since the early 1950s, the NEC has been updated on a regular 3-year basis. Some people ask why you have to do it so often. Others ask, why don't you do it more often? The 3-year schedule works well with the timeline that Megan showed you earlier in the program, as far as the multiple steps that we use to ensure that we are following the ANSI regulations and that we maximize the public input and give everyone an opportunity to participate in that NEC development process. And by the way, the 2017 edition of the NEC, which is the current edition here at NFPA, is the 54th edition of the document. That's a pretty good track record. What's covered by the NEC? It covers premises wiring systems, which is a defined term within the document, but we're not going to get into the weeds on NEC definitions today. But really what that means is it covers from where the utility's responsibility leaves off, all the way to the final light or receptacle or plug in the system. And this covers indoor as well as outdoor installations. And on many of your campuses, you have medium or high voltage electrical distribution systems that aren't necessarily, they look in many cases to be a utility style system, but they're covered in many cases by the NEC because the utility's demarcation point is where the utility regulations end and where the NEC begins. The document is written in primarily prescriptive language. That has worked well in the way that the NEC is used around the country from an enforcement standpoint. It provides a very succinct and descriptive set of regulations that can be easily enforced. The NEC does not contain mandatory referenced standards. That has always been a requirement actually within the NEC style sheet, that there are no mandatory reference standards, and that is to promote easy updating that doesn't carry any additional standards that have to be reviewed. It provides the necessary requirements to establish the acceptable level of electrical safety. Some people refer to it as the minimum level. I personally don't like to use the word minimum when it comes to the NEC because I think it diminishes the importance of that set of safety rules. It's not intended to be a design document, nor is it a DIY document. Neophytes to the electrical world will take a look at the NEC and they'll say, well, what does that mean? And that's exactly why we don't promote its use as a DIY document. It's a technical document. There needs to be some electrical background in order to really understand and comprehend the rules within the NEC. It is the linchpin of the American Electrical Safety System. And the American Electrical Safety System is comprised of the installation code, the NEC, and any local amendments that may have been made, certainly product certification and the testing of products to make sure that they're going to perform as intended by organizations such as UL and many of the other third-party certification bodies, is the second leg of the stool. Trained installers and trained inspectors is another major piece of this. But again, what Megan is going to talk about in detail later on is how there are certain groups who are trying to chip away at the important rules within the National Electrical Code, and not only chip away specifically at the rules, but put delays into adoption. Using the NEC and the latest edition of the NEC as the enforcement tool or the regulatory tool, it provides the necessary level of safety. The NEC is really a history book of electrical installations in this country. There are legacy wiring systems such as knob and tube that are still covered in the NEC because they're still in use in many buildings around the country. But our industry is changing at a very rapid pace as far as new technologies, new ways to manage and distribute electrical energy. And it's incumbent upon the NEC to keep pace with what is going on in the electrical industry. And in many cases, we're reactive because technology outpaces the development cycle. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that we carefully vet rules that are covering new electrical systems and new technologies to make sure that we have the most effective safety rules in place. It does provide an opportunity to use many of the legacy systems that are still in existence, as well as to make sure the new technologies can be safely implemented. Also, as I mentioned earlier, from the original purpose of a national electrical code. It does standardize the rules across the country, and it allows the manufacturers to build one set of products. The problem when adoptions are delayed, that certain rules on products may change, and it does impact the supply chain around the country. Also, from an electrical design standpoint, there are many national electrical design firms that quite often their approach is to use the latest edition of the National Electrical Code. Also, it is the basis for every electrician's licensing exam in this country, and there are many states that have reciprocal licensing agreements. And one of the primary benchmarks for reciprocal licensing agreements is that states that do have these agreements are using the most recent edition of the National Electrical Code. There is a group of states, the National Electrical Reciprocal Alliance, 16 states, and all of those states but 2 are on the 2017 NEC. So the licensing drives the use of the latest edition. You may be familiar with some of our other electrical documents. The NEC provides the installation rules, but 2 other very important electrical safety documents are NFPA 70B, which is a recommended practice on electrical equipment maintenance, and 70E on workplace, it's the workplace safety standard to protect those who have to work on electrical systems. So we look at 70B, 70E, and 70 as kind of a 3-legged stool for electrical safety. We have the installation piece, we have the maintenance piece, and then we have the worker safety piece. When all of those are being followed, it does promote a higher level of electrical safety. 72 is the fire alarm and signaling code. 79 is industrial machinery. Many of you are impacted by 110 as far as emergency power systems. NFPA 720 covers the carbon monoxide protection. 780 is the lightning protection standard. 790 and 791 are field evaluation body accreditation, and also how to evaluate equipment that doesn't come with a product certification. And then there are 2 new documents that are under development, and that's NFPA 1078 and 78, and that's a professional qualification standard on electrical inspectors, and NFPA 78 will be a guide to electrical inspection. At nfpa.org, there are several tools that we provide to show how the NEC is being used around the country as that regulatory document. This page, the screenshot, shows you the NEC adoption maps, and there are several tools here. In addition to those maps, there is a toolkit to help promote NFPA updates or NEC updates. Within that toolkit, there's summary of changes of some of the most recent editions of the NEC. We also, in this static format, this map is updated every month, and it shows the current NEC in effect in all 47 states that have some form of statewide implementation. And you can see that there are currently 27 states using the 2017 NEC, 16 states using the 2014, 1 state is using the 2011, and we have 3 states that are using the 2008 edition. So there are 3 cycles behind. Those are 3 cycles not only of the safety benefits that each new edition brings, but also 3 cycles behind on new technologies that are included in those subsequent editions that people may be missing out on because there isn't a set of installation rules within that jurisdiction that allows for implementation of those new technologies. I've run into that in a couple of states where they went in and kind of from an a la carte perspective selected a new article to update their current outdated electrical code because they needed to cover that particular type of installation. One was a large solar field installation. A new article in the 2017 code covered those large-scale PV systems, but their currently adopted electrical code in that jurisdiction didn't address it. Also, many changes on solar photovoltaics, Article 690, and jurisdictions have, again, from an a la carte perspective, gone in and updated, which certainly isn't the way that the code is intended to be used. This map indicates the states that are currently in the process of updating to the 2017. So there are 10 more states, and we expect that those 10 states will have implemented the 2017 edition by the end of 2019. In addition, we have a table that provides a list of all of the states and what edition they have implemented, updated to. And also the name of the state is a link to the agency that promulgates the code. Now, these maps in this list is the adoption of the code that has the largest impact in the state. It impacts either construction or licensing on a wide scale in that particular jurisdiction. If you click on that link, for instance, if you clicked on California, it would take you to the California Building Standards Commission page. Or if you clicked on North Dakota, it would take you to the North Dakota State Electrical Board page. Or if you clicked on the Massachusetts link, it would take you to a Fire and Electrical Safety Codes page that is sponsored by the Mass Department of Fire Services. So what that does, it allows you to go to the site of the promulgating agency so you can directly follow what's going on in the update process in that particular state. We have a new tool at NFPA. It's called Code Finder, and this not only tracks the implementation of the NEC, but all other NFPA codes and standards. And this is interactive. Unlike the NEC maps I just showed you, this is an interactive type of process. So you can look at NFPA codes and standards used worldwide. You can focus on just the United States. If you hover your cursor over one of those states, it will, and you also can select electrical or all codes, or you can go and search on a specific code, and you can see whether it is adopted either directly, incorporated by reference, or whether it is adopted indirectly through the reference in another code, such as ICC building code. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Megan so she can talk to you about some of these challenges to the electrical code.
Thanks, Jeff. As Jeff noted, we're seeing sort of a skepticism to hostility particularly from state legislators to regulations writ large, but also specifically to codes and standards. And so I thought the best way to illustrate this might be to show you a clip from the floor of the Kentucky State Senate, where they were debating a bill that would have made it easier for lawmakers to directly change provisions in the National Electrical Code or in the state use of the National Electrical Code.
I'm in the building business, built almost 100 apartments over the last 4 years, building 5 houses currently. And ground fault breakers, this bill, talking about that, is a big part of what we're talking about now. The cost has went up dramatically over the last several years because of the previous administration at the federal level. I think this body is full aware in both parties of some of the federal regulations that's not been business friendly. And this amendment or this bill simply creates an opportunity for us to change things that we see fit. There's no electricians wanting to come to your house that's a licensed electrician that wants to do faulty, unsafe work. They would have responsibility and liability to come back and fix that. their insurance would have responsibility. They want to make it more efficient. One of the things that we have, Mr. President, in our apartments is they'll call us and they'll say, I'm going to use my name, Mr. President, if that's okay. They'll say, Jared, I plugged up my curling iron and my lights are not working now. And so I go over there and it's a ground fault breaker. The first thing that we like to do, Mr. President, we have our electrician do it, his license, is we like to try to change those to make it much more efficient to where our customers and our clients aren't calling us in the middle of the night because these things are happening. They don't work well, Mr. President. That's the reason for this bill. It's not about saving lives. We could say this bill is going to save lives. We could say that on everything up here. There's nothing in this bill that's going to be a detriment to somebody's safety. And that's why I encourage all members to support it. I'm in the bill.
So you can see that we're concerned with non-experts wading into the technical realm of the National Electrical Code or any code, and encouraging changes or implementing changes that do have safety impacts, and wading into ground fault circuit interrupters or anything technical of that nature. So I've sort of analyzed what we've been seeing in terms of trends from state legislators with the bills that they're introducing and passing in some cases, and categorized it as delays, analysis paralysis, and interference. And so what I mean by that, we've seen examples in a lot of states. Pennsylvania is one, where there have been bills introduced to delay the review and implementation of those updated code additions. And we've seen the analysis paralysis, where they require burdensome and sometimes unrealistic financial impact or cost impact assessments. A good example of that is North Carolina, where I think it was around 2008, they passed a bill to require increased or a much heavier analysis of any code provision that might change the cost of residential construction by $80 per housing unit, which has the practical effect of slowing down the process and discouraging implementation of any new safety measures. And then the last one on interference, where a lot of states have these independent boards or had independent boards that were responsible for updating electrical codes as well as other codes, and growing legislative interference. So a good example of that is Utah, where they did have an independent board. And now the updates, they're sort of more of an advisory role, and those updates have to be approved by the state legislature before they can go forward. So we're seeing growing interference, and so that's, like I said, in the past 8 to 10 years. And so what the effect of that has been is I've got two maps here that show from January of 2015 and one of January of 2018. So both of those dates are about a year after the code addition, the code update from NFPA had been available. And so about a year after the 2014 edition of the National Electrical Code had been out and available, we had 23 states that had adopted it. And in 2018, the January 2018, which is about a year after the 2017 edition had been available, we only have 18 states that had adopted it at that point, having lost 5 states. And so this, looking a year later at both of those maps, we see that we're up to 27 sort of on par, but still have states that are on the 2008 edition, which by now is about a decade old. So I became interested through the Policy Institute of looking at what the amount of time that it takes states to do this might tell us about what they're doing. Since it's interesting that states are doing inherently the same task, which is updating the code that they use to regulate electrical installations, but take wildly different amounts of time to do that. So all of this graph does is show the duration of promulgation. So from when it was available from National Fire Protection Association to when that state actually completed the promulgation of that code. And so you can see you have a state like Massachusetts, which is incredibly consistent, and every year, every cycle manages to complete the process in under 10 months. And then a state like Rhode Island, where the amount of time that it is taking in each edition seems to increase, and same with a state like New Hampshire. And then a state like Pennsylvania, where they're still on, or at the time that I did this about a year ago, they had taken them over 60 months to promulgate the 2008 edition. So some of the effects of those greater scrutiny and greater pushback from the legislature. You can see it play out among states. And so I'm going to show you the rest of the 50 states. There's don't want to bore you too much with graphs, but it's interesting only in that it is so variable. So the southern states, where you have a state like Georgia, which is very consistent, to a state like Virginia, which is slower and much less consistent. And you can see the same thing in the Midwest, to states with a comparison of South Dakota to Wisconsin, and the western states, where you have a consistent Wyoming and a very inconsistent Hawaii. So I became interested in trying to explain those variations and look, since we have about a third of the states that skipped one or more of the updates that were available in 2008, 2011, and 2014. And, as the graph shown, a lot of variation in the amount of time it takes states to do this. So I became interested if there were different parts of their process that could correlate to whether they took longer or did it more efficiently. So one of the things that did tend to correlate with a more efficient or a less timely time-consuming update process was whether they were using an electrical board. So states that have these independent electrical boards, I think that Jeff alluded to, they tend to, they skip fewer editions of the NEC, and they move more quickly than states without those boards. And another correlation was states that promulgate their electrical code through the building code, where it's incorporated by reference into the IBC or something. They take much longer, and versus states that dedicate the time and energy to update it independently. So we could look at the mechanisms behind the processes and learn, correlate those to different, the amount of time that it takes, and correlate that somewhat to different parts of the process. But we're also interested in learning directly from people who've been involved in the process to know how it's changed over time and what they have observed through their participation in it. So we commissioned interviews, both telephone interviews and web-based surveys, we had 27 participants representing 16 different states, and these are people that have served in some capacity on a code promulgating board, but were no longer no longer serving. And we learned from them, got some very good insights from them about what they've been seeing. And I'm going to run through some of those now. So they did report seeing a growing political involvement, and those are a couple of quotes from some of those interview participants. But they noted that they were, that there was growing influence of politics, and that legislators were increasingly circumventing these committees and boards and becoming more directly involved in the process, which had an effect of delaying and, in some cases, diluting the level of safety as legislators got closer to the process. They also, all of the participants that we talked to who are working on these boards or had worked on these boards talked about the importance of expertise and the value of the people, the high professionalism of the people who were involved in these state level adoption boards, but also expressed concern that there were fewer and fewer people willing to take these positions, which were generally, state appointed or governor appointed, and that with increasing political interference, that they could be losing the independence and thus the prestige of serving on one of these boards in the first place. So concerned that they were their standing was being eroded. And the last one I'll focus on is they did report a very narrow focus on cost, and that the cost was always considered in a one-sided way and with never any consideration of benefits, and that it also was added time to the whole review process as they had to provide more and more, or somehow figure out how to provide more and more data and more analysis on the cost side. So from this, synthesizing what we learned from looking at the data and the processes, as well as what we learned from talking to the people who had been involved with it, was some recommendations for policymakers, and one of which is as a way to argue against easing the political pressure, is that they need to consider leveraging the national process. And that's educating the lawmakers about the national process that has over 400 participants in developing the National Electrical Code from all different areas represented, of all different interest areas represented, and that further review and by legislators becomes ineffective and duplicative of that expert review at the very beginning of the process that also comes with availability of public participation. And then also that we highly recommend that they rely on the experts they have in their state, and that, particularly with this electrical boards having such high levels of professionalism, that it's a real resource, and that they run the risk of losing it if it's not valued. We also recommend to prioritize regular statewide adoption of the NEC and not let it lag behind while they are waiting for the building code. And then also, that costs need to be considered holistically and in context. So, $80 per housing unit. Well, what is that? What are the safety benefits, and are you adding them up over time, or are you just simply doing a one-off summation when you're looking at that? So those are our high-level recommendations to policymakers. And in terms of why it should matter to them from what their constituents want, we did another poll where we polled 1,000 U.S. residents about their expectations around fire and life safety. And I won't read all of these bullet points to you, but you can see that the overwhelming feeling or expectation among the public is that lawmakers should be prioritizing safety and using the latest safety knowledge available to regulate the construction of homes and other buildings. So for instance, 86% of those surveys believe that if they purchased a newly constructed home today, it would meet the most up-to-date codes. And we know that in a lot of states, that may not be the case. So it's a great opportunity to talk to you all today, and sort of the charge to the community of folks who are involved in the physical environment or the buildings and life safety is an opportunity to prompt folks to get involved with their state level processes, as well as, of course, the NFPA process, but being a touch point in your state to talk about the importance of codes and standards, educating lawmakers, getting involved in the state review process of updated codes for the NEC and for any other codes that you are following and are interested in. And knowing what edition of the code that your state uses. So I want to turn it to Jeff to talk about some of the more direct APA NEC connections.
Thank you, Megan. And just a little further on the leveraging of the national process. I attend many of these meetings where the code is being discussed, and I look at the composition of the boards, and in many cases, it's unfortunate that the composition is stacked against the furthering of safety, and that's quite often a barrier that's put in the way of keeping the adoptions up to date. The other thing is, within the legislative process, there's far less balance in that process than there is in the NEC process. In order for us to have our NC approval, there has to be a balance of interests. And as Megan mentioned, we have over 400 volunteer subject matter experts representing a multitude of different segments of the electrical industry. And in order to change the code, there has to be a 2/3 consensus, and no more than one group cannot have any more than 1/3 of the seats on the NEC committee. So there is balance built into that system to make sure all voices are heard. APA has been involved in the NEC development process. They've had membership on NFPA committees, on the NEC committee, as well as other NFPA committees. There have been public inputs or proposals to change the code submitted on behalf of the organization. So you folks and your organization is involved in the process. So you are stakeholders. The good thing is that, yes, you're involved in the process, but our process ends when the code is issued by our Standards Council. The next step in the process to make sure all that good work that's done by the experts gets implemented is the statewide or municipal or county or however the code is put into effect in your jurisdiction. That's where we need you to be involved. Also, the Fire Protection Research Foundation, which is the research arm of NFPA, is currently doing a fairly extensive activity on looking at electrical feeder and branch circuit loading. The efficacy of the new lighting technologies, as well as motors and federal standards on transformers, for instance. We have cut down on electrical usage in buildings significantly. So this is providing input to the NEC process to take a look at, are some of the legacy rules on load calculations still relevant? And APA has been very active in participating in that process, and they are in a new piece of the Fire Protection Research Foundation activity. They are going to be represented. I wanted to mention that recent editions of the NEC contain requirements that have a direct impact on the wiring system in dormitories, the tamper-resistant receptacles, as well as arc fault circuit interrupter protection. And for those of you in the academic world and whose facilities include dormitories, I'm sure you have been in those units where there are extension cords and cords of appliances and chargers being used, and the students, they accept the fact that there's electricity there and that if they plug into it, it's going to be available, but they don't understand some of the nuances of pinching extension cords and things like that. So that's where the arc fault circuit interrupter piece was put into play for dormitories in a recent edition of the NEC. Additionally, the 2017 NEC has done some work on load calculation requirements that are designed to be compatible with model energy codes, and it's very likely that the 2020 NEC is going to contain some more new rules on load calculations that very well may reduce the overall lighting load, which has the net effect of reducing the size of electrical infrastructure. And an additional safety benefit is the fact that when the size of the electrical infrastructure is reduced, the amount of energy that a worker might be exposed to while they're doing maintenance on electrical equipment is going to be lessened. So there's a lot of good things that are on the forefront in the 2020 National Electrical Code.
So that concludes our presentation today, and we wanted to open it up for any questions or comments. And it looks like that we have some that have been submitted through the platform, so we'll start with those. The question is, does NFPA offer study materials for those seeking to prepare for licensing exams? I'll let you take that.
Yeah. We don't have anything right now directly that's aimed at that segment for people that are taking licensing exams. Certainly the National Electrical Code and the National Electrical Code Handbook are excellent resources. We do have some other electrical products that would be useful to someone studying for an exam, but right now we don't have a product specifically aimed at a person who's preparing to take the electrical exam. Thanks for the suggestion, though.
So the other question, did our survey note any involvement by ALEC in the regulatory, in resistance to adopting NEC updates? I assume here ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council, and no, nothing specific from ALEC. I mean, they're an organization that is generally pushing back on any anything that they perceive as having regulatory implication. And I would say that our greatest, the largest segment of opposition that we generally have is from the home building industry specifically, and I'll say the building industry writ large, but the home builders, which often do have quite a bit of clout in state legislatures. And somebody else had asked why did the states that skipped NEC updates, why did they do that? I think it's a variety of reasons. In some cases, it's from direct lobbying by the home building industry. In others, I'll pick on New Hampshire for a minute, and actually more from the fire code perspective. They tend to view, the legislators themselves got sort of overwhelmed with reviewing the fire code and this idea that it was not only the fire code itself, but then the reference documents within that it was somehow hundreds of pages of new regulations, and so a real misunderstanding about the code process, and there may have been lobbying from others in there as well, but it did sort of was portrayed as a misunderstanding by the legislators of the code process. So that can factor into it as well, seeing it as new regulations rather than just updating existing regulations to make sure they're current with the times.
Yeah, Megan, another piece on the opposition and where some of the opposition is coming from, and we know that it is being orchestrated at a national level, because many of the talking points that we hear at these meetings, whether it's a board or a commission or a legislative meeting, it's the same talking points. And we know it's on the agenda at a national level to not only oppose specific requirements that are in the NEC, but to also put into play the delayed adoption cycles. So it is not just a locally orchestrated issue. It is on a national level that we're dealing with this. A couple other questions that we've received. What are the consequences of not updating to the latest edition of the NEC or other construction codes? I mentioned this a little bit as we talked about it. Number one, you lose out on all of the increases in electrical safety that comes with each new edition. As I mentioned, the NEC is continually evolving and using the available technologies to make electrical systems safer. We have not eliminated shock and electrical fire accidents. And yes, some of those occur in legacy systems. But what we have learned from the legacy systems is that we can improve on the way we protect new electrical systems. And in many cases, I'll give you for instance, the ground fault circuit interrupter that legislator in Kentucky was pontificating about. Ground fault circuit interrupters, it is documented by the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission that those devices, since they were first implemented in 1971, have reduced the number of electrocutions in this country. I don't have a percentage, but that information is available. Arc fault circuit interrupters, another new technology. We've relied on fuses and circuit breakers for many years to protect electrical wires and cords that are plugged into the outlets. And those worked well. They were the best available technology. But now we have new technologies, and there's always a hesitation on the part of not only the practitioners, but the consumers on implementing this new technology. But the NEC has a proven track record. It's worked extremely well for 125 years. And I can't think of anything that has been put into the NEC that we've gone back and said, oh, that didn't work, let's take it out. The other thing is many of your national design firms are designing to the latest edition of the code. And there may be differences between a state-adopted code and the latest edition of the NEC, and so that puts those people in kind of a quandary as to their electrical designs. Also, as I mentioned, the electrical reciprocal agreements, that has a big impact. And I did talk about the states having to go in and update their code because their currently adopted code lacked the necessary regulatory rules to cover these new installations that were going in.
And I'll note too, Jeff, that in some cases, in a lot of cases, new editions of the code may make something more efficient to install, and may actually end up costing less. So, for instance, Jeff talked about the potentially sizing different electrical systems smaller due to the fact that things are more energy efficient now in buildings. Well, if you're on an older edition of the electrical code that doesn't permit that, then your regulatory body may not allow that design, and you lose out on a potential savings.
That's a terrific point, Megan. I can point to any number of requirements in the 2017 code that have a positive cost impact as far as the cost to the end user.
We thought it'd be a good opportunity to ask if anybody listening today has participated in the code update process in their own state, and if they have any thoughts on their experience and what they would want us to improve about it.
Megan and Jeff, while people are thinking about that, we had a couple of polls that we wanted to take. So I'm going to go ahead and launch one of the first polls.
Okay.
And we'll give it a few seconds here for people to answer.
While they're answering that, Billy, one of the other questions that was submitted was, how does NFPA view amendments that are promulgated through a state update process? And certainly, we put the NEC out or any of our other codes and standards, and we view them as being the necessary set of rules to regulate that particular installation. However, we don't disrespect the right of a promulgating agency to enact an amendment that may address a particular geographic or environmental or some other impact by strengthening the code. But when we see amendments that are so transparent that it is being sponsored by people who want to diminish electrical safety by cutting costs with no good validation, that's where we, at these meetings, we try to speak against those amendments and promote the code being updated as written.
I'd also add to that sort of emphasizes the point of having, or the importance of having strong independent electrical boards to do the update process, because when there are changes suggested, they're the people that I think we would feel like are in the best position, rather than a state lawmaker, with respect to our friend from Kentucky, to be able to know what the safety implications are of a particular removing or adding something. So we got another question of any correlation of updated code and reduction of electrical safety incidents. This is a very difficult question to answer, only in that the data is very difficult to collect and to discern. So, for instance, for electrical fires, we have the data that comes in from the National Fire Incident Reporting System, which does show us roughly the number of electrical fires every year, which I think is around about $1.8 billion in damage and about 4,000 incidents a year. But that doesn't tell us about when the building was constructed, and so we don't know what the code edition was at the time of the incident. We have some data on different technologies like arc fault circuit interrupters and their success in reducing the number of fires, but that's kind of the best we have at the moment.
Well, and in many cases, success stories are not a reportable incident, and so it's very hard to track it. So, for instance, with the arc fault circuit interrupters, it will take some time, like it did with the GFCIs, to show the trend of those devices reducing fires in electrical homes. And as Megan mentioned, or in homes rather, as Megan mentioned, without knowing the date of construction, it's very hard to say, okay, what was in place as far as protective devices in that home. So until we start tracking that in our fire reporting data, which we're looking to do, it's hard to develop data on those trends.
There a question about 70E. Somebody had asked, is 70E a mandate by any state agency?
I'm not aware of any state agency that does mandate or specifically promulgate NFPA 70E. However, where 70E gets a lot of its teeth is through the fact that there is a federal agency, and in many states they do administer the occupational health and safety regulations through a state agency. But that's where 70E becomes referenced in a general duty clause type of activity on the part of OSHA or a state health and occupational health and safety organization.
Okay, we have about a minute left here. Our first poll said that 56% who participated currently follow the 2017 edition, 29% on the 2011, 5% older, and 5% that they didn't know. Our second poll, which I'm now going to close, said that 10% adopt their own codes and standards, 76% follow a state or municipal promulgated thing, and 14% that said they did not know.
Cool.
All right, well, that's really helpful. And I guess we'll close. Somebody had asked who appoints the members of the technical committees for the NEC. So that's folks who are interested apply for membership on those panels, and their membership is, Jeff, do you want to say how that?
Yeah, the membership, ultimately the approval of the membership is done by the NFPA Standards Council. Anyone who's interested in becoming a member of one of the NEC technical committees, in the NEC process, they're referred to as code-making panels. But if you go to the NEC document information page, go to technical committee tab, you can apply for membership on any of the NEC panels or any of the other NFPA committees that you might be interested in. Certainly, your APA association is a good credential as far as being considered for membership on the panel.
Okay, we are at the top of the hour, so we have a few questions that we didn't get to. I'll send those to Megan and Jeff, and they will answer directly to you. We have your email. So I want to thank our presenters, Megan and Jeff, for this presentation. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us. So hopefully look for our announcement. We'll have another webinar in February. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.